For this next exercise, we will be doing a falling piece of paper and a falling brick in Adobe Animate, and it'll look something just like this. So we're going to go to Adobe Animate, make a new document, standard 24 frames per second. Let's click on HD, which is 1280 by 720, and that should be good enough. So first thing that we're going to do is we're going to make our ground plane. So I just made a new layer. I'm using the line tool, and we're just going to click and draw. We're going to make a new layer. I'm going to lock the ground plane, and the new layer is going to be brick. We're just getting things set up. One thing I should mention, when it comes to this pre-recorded demo, I have sped up a lot of it in order to make it a little bit quicker than in real time. I will slow things down when we're doing a general playback. So nothing too extraordinary. I am just making a brick using our rectangle tool. Right now, though, I am converting the brick into a symbol, specifically a graphic, and so now that will be stored in our library, and that will come into play in a little while. So I'm just going through and extending the timeline. If you do F5 on your computer, that will extend and add frames. So the next thing that I'm doing is I'm making a little line to show where the brick is going to actually make contact with. What I'm doing right now is I'm selecting in the middle of my timeline, and I'm going to create a motion tween for my brick layer. We haven't used motion tweens before. I mentioned it briefly in class the other day, but now we're going to implement it with this particular project. So I right-clicked anywhere in between the timeline and clicked motion tween, and just by dragging that brick anywhere on our stage, it will make a new keyframe. As you can see right here, I'm just moving that keyframe a little bit closer to the starting point. That way there's less time between the start and the end, so it goes a little bit faster, because I feel like as a brick, it's going to fall relatively quickly. If you double click on your timeline for this particular layer, you're going to get this sub menu for our motion tween. And at the moment, I am simply going in with the pen tool, and I'm tweaking this motion so that way I'm easing in to that motion. So that way it's speeding up as it's hitting the ground. In addition to being able to change the motion between these 2 points, I can actually sever it. So right now I right-clicked and I'm going to split motion. This is critical. Otherwise, if we don't do this, it's going to make our graph editor almost impossible to use. It's going to become really complicated. And so by splitting it, it's going to allow me to just focus on this initial part, and then I can work with the graph editor and tweak that falling down motion. By splitting it, now I can do a bounce back up and control the X and Y individually, and it won't be influenced by what's happening there. What I'm showing at the moment is with my object, it essentially recognizes its starting values for both the X and the Y. And so if I ever need to go back to its original state, well, I can essentially plug that back in. As you see, I just split the motion again. I'm just dragging this. And so now, if I play this back, we're going to have just this little thud and a little bit of a bounce. Admittedly, it's probably not going to actually do that, but we're in cartoon world. So I thought it'd be nice to have just a slight bounce here. So I'm just going through, I'm kind of tweaking this. Unfortunately, when it comes to animation, there's going to just be a lot of fine tuning. So at the moment, I'm just playing around, seeing what is the right easing in, easing out of that motion. And I'm playing through and just assessing if that feels right. You're going to have to scrub a lot of your timeline and just consistently play and observe. This comes down to observation. So sometimes going through and changing our layer so that it is just on outlines will help us kind of see what's happening a little bit more clearly. I'm also playing around with squash and stretch. One of the great things about using these motion tweens is it also allows us to implement squash and stretch. So just dragging this down just a little bit. And this is really only 3 frames that I'm tweaking at the moment. So I'm just going back up, playing it, and it seems to be pretty good. So the next step is, well, after it bounces and hits, I kind of want it to actually fall over. And so I'm going to go a little bit further ahead of my timeline. I'm going to right click, split motion, and I want to rotate it. However, with my current setup, I have my pivot point right in the center. I want to change the pivot point, and we can do that if we hit Q on our keyboard, and that will bring us to the transform function, and then we can click and drag where we want our pivot point. And so now you can see right here, I'm just scrubbing through to get my motion down. And the one thing that I don't necessarily care for when it comes to the motion tween is the interface is a little clunky. Admittedly, I am not as accustomed to it, so you might have to scale up your timeline a little bit or descale it in order for you to effectively use your motion tween and adjust the parameters in the graph editor. And this feels pretty good. So I think we can probably move from there. If I double click on my motion tween, it will collapse it. So that way it's out of the way. Now we can move forward, and we're going to add in a shadow. Admittedly, I am just going to add in the shadow for this iteration of the exercise, the one that I do in class. I will not add in the shadow just because it's maybe a little cumbersome and unnecessary. So I just went and got my oval tool, drew on the new layer, and I'm going to tweak it and so that it feels like it's about the right size. And before I do anything further, I need to convert this into a symbol, specifically a graphic, in order for me to add in the classic tweens. So I'm going to my main keys for the brick, and I'm going to add a new key for the shadow, so that way it changes in relation to the brick. So just right click, add in new keyframe, kind of distort it, tweak it, etc., etc. And just fine tuning it. And we'll go to our last position where it flips over, and we'll click, drag, scale it up so that it seems it's about the right size. Now the next thing that we're going to do is we're going to change the opacity of it. So if we click on the object in our properties and we go to color effects, we have a number of options. And so we're going to click on alpha. And the alpha will allow us to change the transparency of whatever object that we have. And so this is going to make it seem just a little bit more realistic, that as it's coming closer to the ground, well, it's going to block more light. Therefore, it's going to get darker in value. So now I'm going through, I'm adding in our classic tweens, just so that way it's changing both the scale of it as well as the opacity consistently. Now, these aren't perfect as is, so I'm going to go through just like what we've done with some of our previous assignments. And we're going to click in our properties and we're going to alter the tween for each one of these classic tweens. So that way there's a little bit of easing in or easing out depending on what is needed between each keyframe. So just changing it, seeing what works, seeing what doesn't work. Once again, this goes back to a feel thing. And so I'm going to consistently scrub through, kind of seeing what works, what's not working. And I know something feels a little bit off. So I'm going back in, just trying to reassess it. And I'm noticing right here, just before it makes contact, it's not small enough. So I'm going to have to add in another keyframe. So I'm right-clicking, insert keyframe, scale this down so that it feels appropriate for the squash and stretch, and that feels a lot better. So just constantly observing what you have in your timeline, playing it back, and making the necessary corrections. So the next thing we're going to do is, well, let's go one step deeper. So we were in scene 1, but we made the brick into a symbol, specifically a graphic. So I double-clicked on the brick, and we're going to go in and we're going to change this design so that way it's a nested loop. And we're going to give this a little bit more of a hand-drawn feel. So I'm just going to make 4 separate blank keyframes that I'm going to hand draw a brick. But by just having it in a stationary position, but by constantly drawing more or less the same object, there's going to be slight inconsistencies with my drawing. And so it's going to give it a little bit of wobble, but actually a little bit of life. And it's going to feel consistent with the steps that we do later on. So I've sped up this footage just so that you didn't have to sit through it. I'm using the brush tool and I'm playing it back. It's not exactly perfect, but it's giving it a little bit of life, going through, changing it, etc., etc. Now, this is going to be a brick with kind of like those 3 circles in the center of the brick. So I got a different color. I'm just drawing those in, and I'm going to repeat these steps. And one thing I'm going to show you in a few moments, I didn't realize which drawing mode I was on. So I'm going to have to go back in and correct these shapes in a little bit. So it looks decent. Maybe going to do a few tweaks here and there. Kind of didn't like that line, maybe a little too offset. So just making those corrections. I'll go back into the main timeline. We'll see how this looks in context with everything else. It's a little too sped up, so let's slow this down real quick. And gonna go back through here. I'm gonna delete that layer because it was playing back kind of incorrectly. So now, see what happened? That looked pretty decent. So I want to fill this in though. And when I click on each keyframe, you can kind of see, oh man, each stroke that I made was automatically turned into an object because I had it on drawing object mode. So I'm going to have to go in here in a little bit and change that. At the moment, I'm trying to fill it in, but because they're individual objects, it's not going to work. So I try persistently, not really realizing what happened. So I'm going to have to select all of these. So you can see when I select each stroke, there's a little bit of a box around it. I'm going to go back to my properties, and there's this icon here, explode object. So it's going to turn each one of them back into just drawn objects. And so now by doing that, I can go in and tweak them, get the paint bucket tool, and on each keyframe, I can fill it in. trying to find the right color that seems decent. Go through, just fill it in. Doesn't have to be perfect. Once again, this might be overkill, but I think it makes it feel just a little bit more resolved. So now we have a falling brick. And it looks more or less kind of resolved. It feels like a finished little animation. And just by having that little inconsistency of the drawing, it gives it just a bit of life. They're on tubes, and it's going to be consistent with what we do next. So now we're going to go forward and we're going to do the paper animation. I'm making 2 more layers, a paper guide. This is going to be very similar to what we did for our previous exercises, but we're actually not going to turn it into a guide layer technically in Adobe Animate. It's just going to be a way to visualize our arcs. So trying to draw in a nice arc. I thought cyan would be a nice color to stand out. In addition, I didn't want it to just kind of go back and forth falling down, so I did a little loop at the end, so it's kind of going back into space. So right now I'm putting in kind of the keys as well as defining some of the extremes, so those middle points. I'm going to change my color. I'm going to go onto a new layer for the paper. I've locked the guide. Now we're going to start drawing. We're starting off small. We're just drawing more or less a flat plane. But we have to think about how that flat plane is going to move in space as well as the material. And so I'm just changing my viewing angle a little bit for my stage. Kind of erasing that one. You're going to see a lot of that erasing. Although this isn't a complicated object, I need to make it feel right. So you're going to see a lot of undos, and you can see my keyboard shortcuts in the lower left hand corner. That one seems decent for the starting point. Now I'm going to kind of go ahead in my timeline and start thinking about where I need to put my next keyframe. So I'm just adding in another keyframe at the 11th frame. But I will need to make it a blank keyframe because, well, I don't really want to keep adding on to the drawing and having the previous key still visible. So making a blank keyframe is important. And so we're going pose to pose as opposed to straight ahead animation. So I didn't do that middle position yet. I'm just doing these storytelling drawings, these keys. Then I'm going to break it down incrementally, constantly refining it. But I need to make sure that this timing for these drawings, these key drawings, feels decent. Now, once I play this back, it's going to be really choppy, but it's still a way for me to get the overall timing down in relation to, the other things that are happening in my sequence. Usually, if you're animating for some sort of production, you're given a time frame that you need to film. And so, by plotting things out in this kind of really rudimentary way, you can get your main beats down. And that's what these key drawings are for. So what I'm showing you here is, well, in between these keys, I need to put my extremes. And I need those extremes to be halfway in between. And in between those extremes, I also want to be able to subdivide it so that way I'm still on twos evenly. And so those would be my breakdown drawings. I want to make sure that when I continue to subdivide this, I'm not going to have another keyframe right next to another keyframe. So playing this back, this seems decent for the most part. This is still a little sped up. just for your convenience, going to go back in. I'm going to add in another blank keyframe. And so I'm going to go through, and I'm noticing that issue once again. I'm going to have to shift this timeline down. So if I just click, hold shift, I can select a good chunk of the timeline and just drag, and that opens up my timeline so that way I can insert more frames. So I'm just going to go through, kind of draw this, and at this point I actually wanted to kind of make this middle drawing between those two arcs a little bit narrower and a little bit more elongated. I'm thinking about squash and stretch. As it's going through that motion, it's kind of pulling it, and so it's going to be more elongated and a little bit more narrow, and it's going to help emphasize that motion. Once again, it doesn't necessarily feel like it quite yet because, well, we're just kind of in the beginning stages of developing our animation. We have to break it down a little bit further. So I've sped this up quite a bit more. That way I can just kind of get through this stage of the process. And we're playing it back at real time, and that doesn't feel too bad. It's not perfect, but it gets us close to where we want it. Now we can start going in and adding in some of those breakdown drawings. That way we can get some of that easing in and easing out of the paper through those arcs to make it feel, once again, more believable. Not necessarily realistic, but more believable. Once again, that is key. We want the motion to be believable. So, just going back in, kind of moving things around, constantly refining it. Because if we had to refine this later on, well, it'd be significantly more work because we have all of these other drawings. So that's why it's really important for you to, in this stage, to just play it back, observe it, kind of watch and meditate on it. So just going to go back and we're going to continue to add in some more frames. These are going to be our breakdown frames. Specifically, we're going to start incorporating the ease in and ease out. So we're just taking the same principles that we've applied to both the roller coaster exercise as well as the ball bounce, and now we're extrapolating it onto this particular scenario. So since this is going to get a little bit faster as it goes through this arc, I'm going to space out each drawing so that it gets incrementally a little bit further away from the previous drawing. Although I'm doing this all on twos, by just changing the position of the drawing, well, it creates that sense of motion. So I think I got the first one in. Let's play it back. It's really subtle, but it's just a start, and we can already see it feeling a little bit better at that very beginning. So we're going to go back in. We're going to add in another blank keyframe, and we're going to continue drawing. So now that it's going to slow into this motion for our second half of this arc, well, they're going to get progressively closer together. I'm actually starting at the drawing that's closest to our initial key. And so you can see the position there. It's pretty close. I'm going to move this back a little bit. And you can see there, I'm kind of highlighting it. So the next drawing I moved back. So I'm increasing the space in order to help that feel like it's slowing in. We'll play it back. And once again, oh, that feels not too bad. It's a start. It's not perfect. But already just by including those 4 additional drawings into this sequence, it's already starting to come together and makes the motion feel just a little bit more believable. So we're going to continue going through this process of refining our motion. So now that we're going through the downward motion of this arc, I'm going to slightly change the direction. And I'm trying to kind of hit this nice middle point between the two drawings that we can see currently in the onion skinning, the drawing before and the drawing after. So you have to do a little bit of thinking when it comes to this process. Although we've set up a decent structure so far between our general timing and our first several drawings, we have to, even with such a simple object, do some calculating, constantly playing it through, seeing if anything feels weird, because we don't want to just go full force, animating it, thinking that everything's going to be good, and playing back, and then things feeling weird. We need to kind of constantly flip through our drawings in order to see if we're on the right track. If something feels off, then we go back and we correct it. So at this moment, I feel like it needs one additional frame in order to kind of slow it down even further at this point. So I was trying to figure out what was the best spot for me to add that in. I think I found it, and now I'm going through and trying to find the halfway point between those two drawings. If you think about it and look at those drawings, I'm trying to essentially subdivide and find an equal drawing between them. And by playing this through, it just slows down just enough right there. It holds it while there's still a little bit of movement to make it feel like there's just a bit more weight to that motion. It's recalibrating and the motion's going to change. And that's exactly what I want. And our initial pass is going to get us pretty darn close. But as we start to play it back, we make corrections as needed. We don't necessarily have to hold completely true to our initial outline. Once again, it's just guesswork from the beginning. Yes, there's some animators that can plot it out completely and perfectly before they even begin to mess around with each individual drawing or pose. We're not going to do that in this class. I can't do that. I wish I could, but I think this gives us the flexibility for us to make corrections as needed, and it gives us the same result. We just have to be maybe a little bit more diligent in paying attention to each playback and analyzing it. So going through, I'm actually removing a frame at the moment because I felt like, it was going maybe too slow at this particular junction, and I wanted it to kind of speed up just a little bit more. And with that last passage of it going through the side loop on the left, I sped up the footage so that way you didn't have to sit through all of that refinement. But pretty much the same principles that we've already talked about are being applied. There's not really anything new. Using the brush tool, I'm drawing, and I'm just calculating where should I put my next drawing. That's really about it. And it's going to take time for this to become customary and natural in your process, but I think there's not really any other way around it. You just have to kind of go through the motion and through the work. So I'm playing it back, and this feels not too bad. I think this is just about where I want it to be. But I want to actually go in and make our sheet of paper opaque. So I'm taking the paint bucket tool and I'm changing the fill to white. And the last little step there, you can change on if you want it to fill in gaps. I'm using the period on my keyboard to essentially cycle through each frame. That way I don't have to use the mouse and I can just go through and fill in each layer. And I think we're pretty much done with this little animation. Once again, a lot of this has been sped up just for your convenience. I recommend that you maybe slow it down if you have any questions or you need to kind of look through stuff.